In this video, we'll continue exploring ways to describe distributions of quantitative data, focusing on measures of center. Measures of center are meant to summarize a typical value for the dataset. These measures include the mean, median, and mode, which are terms you might already be familiar with, but we'll examine them in more detail here to understand what each tells you and identify some potential issues with using each one. Our two research questions were, at what age do mothers have their first child, and has this age changed over the years? And we had data from 1980 and 2018 of mothers' ages when they had their first child. Here is a histogram for the data from 1980, and the mean was 22.6 years. This looks a little larger than what your eye tells you might be typical. I'm going to add two other potential measures of center, and then we'll discuss each one. So, probably 19 years, which is the mode, looks a little more typical. And the median is 21 years, which looks a little closer than the mean does to what is typical. Let's take a look at what each one of these measures is really telling us. First, the mode, which is the value that occurs most frequently. In 1980, the most common age for mothers to have their first child was when they were 19 years old. It can be seen as a peak in the histogram. The mode also makes up part of the shape of the distribution. This histogram was described as unimodal because it had a single mode. Next, let's look at the median. The median is the middle value. In other words, half of the data values are larger and half are smaller than the median. Let's look at an example. Here is a list of numbers in a made-up dataset. To compute the median, you would first arrange the numbers in order from smallest to largest, including repeated values. Then find the largest and smallest values. Then the next largest and smallest, and continue until you find the value in the middle, and this value is the median. If you had an even number of values, then you would repeat this process and the median would be halfway between the two remaining values. So in the case of the mothers' ages, this means that half of the mothers were less than 21 years old when they had their first child, and half were older than 21 years old. Next, let's look at the mean. The mean can be thought of as a balance point for your data. That is, if you imagine that the histogram was a physical object and put it on a plank, then the mean is the place where it would balance. The mean is computed by adding up all of the values of all of the data points and dividing by the number of data points. For example, if these are the values in the data set, then you would compute the mean by adding all of these values and dividing by the number of values. Now, imagine that instead of the largest value in the dataset being 5, it was actually 52. So in the computation for the mean, instead of 5, we'd have 52. This would greatly increase the value of the mean. And these infrequent large values are present in datasets that have outliers, or if they're skewed, like our current dataset, which has a few mothers who had their first child when they were relatively old. This tells us that the mean is affected by outliers and skewed data. So the mean might not be the best choice for summarizing this distribution of mothers' ages. And let's look at the distribution of ages from 2018. In addition to being slightly skewed to the right, this distribution is bimodal, which suggests that there are two distinct underlying populations with different behaviors. Now, the mean for this dataset was 26.9 years, and the median is 26 years. The mean is slightly larger because the data are slightly skewed to the right, and this skew affects the mean. But neither of these values really describe the typical values in the data. Instead, the two modes do a better job of describing the typical ages. In particular, they suggest that one population of mothers tended to have their first child when they were roughly 20 years old, and the other population tended to have their first child when they were roughly 28 years old. And you might be thinking that there is quite a bit of variation. It's not the case that all mothers have their first child at either 20 or 28 years. For that, we'll need to also describe the spread of the data, but we'll do that in the next video. Now, to summarize what we've seen, the center of a distribution summarizes a typical value for the data. We looked at three measures of center: the mode, the median, and the mean. Although the mean is commonly used, it is affected by outliers and skewed data, so it is often not a good way to describe the typical value for the data. And neither the mean nor the median worked well for bimodal data. Each of these measures of center have their own use, and it's important to think about the shape of the distribution when choosing which ones to use.